may have heard this right-wing talking point from Western transphobic ideologues, as well as from Pakistani right-wingers whose transphobic ideology is basically copy-paste from Western transphobic ideology. And that is the comparison between being trans, that is, having a different gender identity than your gender assigned at birth, and claiming to be a different species than what you actually are. Like a human being, for example, claiming to be a dog or a cat or a dragon or whatever, or being of one race, being white, let's say, and then claiming to be black or whatever. And so the idea is that since we wouldn't accept these other things, we wouldn't accept that a human being is actually a cat just because they identify as a cat, and we wouldn't believe that a white person is actually black because they identify as black. Therefore, we should also not believe that a biological woman or somebody who is born a woman is actually a man if they identify as such, or a biological man or someone who is born a man is actually a woman if they identify as such. Now, most people intuitively get that this is a false analogy. Like, common sense and intuition tells us that this is just false. There is some relevant difference between being trans and claiming to be some species other than what you are, some race other than what you are, or some age or whatever. I've heard different versions of this. And for the practical purposes, common sense is sufficient. The fact that we intuitively get that this is wrong, this comparison or this analogy, that trans is something normal. It's something that exists in every culture and has existed throughout history. And trans people are good people generally, not every single individual, obviously, but like good, normal people in a way that a human being who actually sincerely claims to be a dog or a cat isn't, in the sense that there's something pathological about claiming to be a different species than what you are. That sounds like maybe psychosis or something, in a way that being trans isn't. And being trans is also not considered psychosis in the scientific community. So the scientific consensus is that this is not a form of psychosis. So common sense and intuition are sufficient for practical purposes. So for the most part, we don't need a philosophically satisfying explanation behind what's disanalogous between trans and, claiming to be a different species, etc. Nevertheless, I am a philosopher and I want to give a philosophically satisfying explanation because it's a form of transphobic propaganda to put people on the spot. Often these propagandists will go to, US university campuses or something and shove microphones in the faces of students and be like, if I say that I'm 16 and I'm actually 25, am I 16 or am I 25? And so I've seen this. I think the PragerU people did something like that. And I've heard people make these kinds of comparisons. I've heard transphobic people in face-to-face conversation. I've heard transphobic people make these analogies. And so it helps if you want. I mean, of course, you can choose not to engage, and it's a highly respectable choice to not engage with transphobic propaganda people. But nevertheless, if you do want to engage, or as an exercise, if you want to understand what exactly is disanalogous, I mean, I want to do that, and I already have done that, and I have what to me is a satisfying explanation behind what is different between trans and these other cases, and I want to say today what I think that explanation is. In order to understand what is disanalogous between trans and these other kinds of cases, we have to have a proper understanding of when we are revising a concept so that we have a modified version of the same concept, and when we are proposing such a radical change that what we're proposing is essentially just a new concept altogether. For example, let's say that somebody were to revise the concept of woman to something like people with blue eyes. Now, that is completely disconnected from how the term woman has historically been used. It's got nothing in common with how the term has historically been used. So it's simply not plausible as a revision in the concept of woman. This is not a new conception of womanhood. This is just a different concept. It's just a concept of people with blue eyes. Unlike that, though, we have actual revisions in the concept of woman, where this has occurred in history, where, let's say, motherhood was seen as quite essential to womanhood at some point in history. In certain historical and cultural contexts, motherhood, the experience of being pregnant, giving birth, and being a mother was seen as quite defining to womanhood. But it isn't anymore. In contemporary culture, it's quite rare for someone to believe that motherhood is essential in that way to womanhood. By essential, by the way, I should mention, I don't necessarily mean necessary. I mean, the word essential I distinguish from necessary. Essential means defining something, defining its nature, whereas necessary means without it. So if X is necessary for Y, then without X, Y cannot exist. Something could be essential to something else and not necessary for it. When I say that motherhood has been seen in certain historical and cultural contexts as essential to womanhood, I don't mean that they believe that what we would now call a cis woman who simply is infertile, let's say, or just chooses not to have children, that individual is literally seen as not a woman, but she's seen as maybe less of a woman. That's a less prototypical example of a woman, that there's some aspect of womanhood that she's failing to live up to or failing to instantiate. So to say that something is essential to being a man or essential to being a woman or essential to whatever the concept is not necessarily saying that it's necessary for that. This is how I'm using the terms anyway. So the revision in the concept of woman, such that being a mother is made either not essential at all or at least less essential, that is a revision within the same concept. It is still recognizable as a continuation of that same concept that has been modified in some way. So in order to determine whether something is a revision in an existing concept or just the proposal of a new concept, we have to understand what is essential and what is necessary for that concept. So when it comes to gender, the way in which it has historically been defined, and when I say gender, I'm talking about someone being a man or someone being a woman, the way it has historically been defined, and this is true in every culture in human society, I'm not aware of any exception to this, it has been defined as a combination of three elements. One is bodily elements. That includes genitalia, whether you can get pregnant or not, various secondary sex characteristics, what your face looks like. And it also includes a socio-cultural element, the kind of clothes that you wear, let's say, the kinds of hairstyles that you have, the kinds of work you participate in. And because of cultural variation, the socio-cultural element, of course, is going to have variations within it. In some society, being a man involves being more ornamented, wearing more makeup, but in most societies, ornamentation is associated more so with womanhood. But there will be cultural variation when it comes to the socio-cultural element of gender because it's socio-cultural element. But nevertheless, there is always some socio-cultural element. There's never no socio-cultural element in any society. At least, certainly I'm not aware of any society in which that's the case. And then there is the psychological element that includes your gender identity as well as your how masculine or feminine you are in terms of your behavior, your personality, and even your sexuality, which is part of a person's personality. That can also be included under the conception of gender. Being attracted to women, for example, can be seen as part of what it means to be a man, and has been, in fact, in many cultures throughout history, and to some extent still is. Being attracted to men has been, and to some extent still is, seen as part of what it means to be a woman. In other words, it is seen as essential to some extent or another, defining the nature of womanhood or manhood. There are already revisions in the conception of gender or in the conception of womanhood or manhood that have occurred throughout history. Motherhood has become less essential in our conception of womanhood. Being attracted to the opposite gender has become less essential in our conception of gender, and so on with various other things. I mean, doing certain kinds of labor, we've reconceptualized when it comes to that as well. Like, we think that you don't have to participate in these kinds of work, or even if you do these kinds of things, you still can be a certain gender. Even if you're a soldier, you can still be a woman. Even if you're homemaker, you can still be a man, etc. And so this is mainly the result of the feminist movement and the gay rights movement that you have had this progress when it comes to our conception of gender. But these all count as revisions in our conception of gender. These are not proposals of a new concept, they're revisions because they're not very drastic changes, but are small changes where there's enough that is continuous from the older concept that we can consider it to be still the same concept but revised. What the trans rights movement is claiming, though, so we're talking about the modern trans rights movement that mainly took off in 2015, although it started earlier than 2015, but it reached a certain peak in 2015. What we trans rights activists are claiming is that we should do another revision, which is along the same lines as existing revisions. It is a continuation of the same process, and that is to simply drop the bodily requirement as a necessary condition, or to drop the bodily elements of gender as a necessary condition for having that gender. And so you can think of the traditional conception of gender as something like a cluster of traits. You can think of it as an archetype, and that cluster includes, like I said, bodily elements, sociocultural elements, and psychological elements. And to some extent, that'll still be there in our archetype of like manhood and womanhood. Like, we do think that it's more being prototypically a man to have a penis and testes than it is to have a vulva and vagina. But having a penis and testes or not having a vagina and vulva are not necessary for being a man. This is what we are proposing, what the trans rights movement is proposing, is that it be dropped as a necessary condition. It's not such a drastic change that we can't consider this to be continuous from notions of manhood and womanhood. We are saying that keep the social cultural requirement, to some extent, of course. Emphasis should be more so on the expression of your gender identity in a socially salient way rather than on conforming to certain social norms, but that's still social cultural. Keep the psychological requirement, put the emphasis more on gender identity rather than on other elements of psychological masculinity and femininity, and drop the bodily requirement as far as it being a necessary condition for being a woman or a man is concerned. So it is still recognizable as a conception of womanhood or manhood, but it is nevertheless a revised conception. And not only is this revision quite easy to do, I mean, it's not cognitively very difficult. You can clearly see that if you've got, say, a trans man who has transitioned socially, especially if he's also transitioned medically, he looks like a man anyway, and A lot of people just find it quite intuitive and commonsensical to just consider him a man. In fact, it's easier to consider him a man than it is to consider him a woman. I cannot consider trans men women or trans women men once they have transitioned socially. I actually cognitively cannot do that. If I look at them, it's not even that I'm trying to be polite. I'm sitting in the privacy of my room. They don't know that I'm thinking about them. I'm looking at a photograph of a trans man on Instagram or whatever. He doesn't know I exist. He looks like a man. I could stare as hard as possible at that picture, and I could squeeze my mind or whatever to really try to see this person as a woman, and I literally cannot, because he just looks so much like a man. When it comes to other concepts, that's not the case. If you have a South Asian person, let's say, who is culturally not South Asian, who's culturally very white Canadian or whatever it is, okay, then that just means that this person's a South Asian person who's culturally atypical. But that's not cognitive. I can conceptualize that. It's a coherent possibility in my mind. But that's not the case with like someone who completely looks like a man, me thinking of that person as a woman, but just a very, very masculine woman. So that's one reason in favor of engaging in this further revision of the conception of man and woman, is that it's already in line with common sense. Another reason in favor is that it promotes inclusivity of trans people and it furthers the rights and equality of trans people. And these two reasons are legitimate for the revision of concepts. We've done this in other cases as well, where there's revising a concept of what it means to have a certain nationality or what it means to have a certain religion. We've already engaged in revisions that are driven partly by our own common sense and intuition, but also driven by social justice aims. We can have practical or ethical aims as constraints on how we conceptualize things and as reasons for reconceptualizing something or revising some concept, as long as the revision is still such that we can recognize it as continuous from the same concept. In fact, it doesn't just further inclusivity of trans people, it also furthers inclusivity of everybody, cis people as well. So there are cis people that are atypical, they're gender non-conforming or whatever, it furthers inclusivity for them as well. Now, when it comes to things like species, race, and so on, the kinds of analogies that these transphobic people make, they don't involve these kinds of plausible proposed reconceptualizations. What they involve is dropping what is really essential to the concept such that it's no longer recognizable as that concept at all. So let's consider a race. We're talking about the race of an individual. We're not talking about at a group level. At a group level, there already have been changes in how we think of certain races. So for example, what it means to be white is not culturally universal. The group that's considered white people in the context of Brazil or Mexico, for example, is not the same as the group that's considered white people in the context of the US or the UK or Germany or whatever. Similarly, over time, the same group can be re-racialized, meaning the racialization of that group can change so that they are considered white later but weren't earlier, like in the case of the Irish, let's say. So that's at the group level. But at an individual level, an individual's race is always determined by the race of at least one of their biological parents. It's determined by their biological parents. It doesn't have to be that both their biological parents have to have that race, but at least one has to. And this has always been the case with conceptions of race. There's no conception, sometimes you have no conception of race, right? There are societies where there simply is no such thing as race. But when you have a conception of race, it is always determined by your parentage, your individual race. In the cultural sense, of course, you can become integrated into another culture and then adopt those cultural elements, but culture is not the same thing as race. And so your parentage is essential, and it's very essential to your race. So if you have a situation where, like Rachel Dolezal or whatever it is, where someone's both parents are white and that person claims to be black, that claim is just false. They may be culturally black, they may have the desire to be black, but they are not black. And the reason is because black and white are racial terms, and race is inherently tied to parentage. The same thing applies to species. When it comes to species, the individual species is determined by their parents. The biological parents of an individual determine that individual species. And this has always been the case with species. This is always how we define it. Of course, there's fuzziness and difficulties around how exactly we define the boundaries of a species at a group level, but at an individual level, when it comes to the categorization of an individual organism, the species is always determined by the parents of that individual. When evolution happens, it does not happen in a single generation, it is a gradual process, and there is no single generation in which one individual organism has a different species than their biological parents. And that property of considering yourself to be a different species than what your actual species is, like considering yourself a cat when you're a human being, is not the same as your species. So it's not plausible to say that your species is determined by whether you call yourself a cat or a dog or whatever. No, it's determined by your biological parents. I want to emphasize that the issue is not whether you can change the relevant characteristics. At least it's not just that. So it's true that when it comes to gender, you can change your appearance and you can also change your physical characteristics through medical transition. And that is relevant because social role is one of the elements of gender. This is what we're proposing, and this is increasingly becoming accepted, that gender be defined in terms of gender identity and social role. Gender identity is your self-categorization into gender categories. So the two main gender categories are men and women, but there are other gender categories as well in various cultural and historical contexts. So which category you associate yourself with in a spontaneous and authentic way, that's your gender identity. Your social role is the expression of gender identity in a socially salient way. In other words, it's how you present yourself in society, where you present yourself as a member of that group. And so the fact that people can change their appearance and so on is relevant to the social role aspect of it, because that's part of the process of taking on a certain social role. If you're changing social role, which is the case with trans people. The reason why there is trans when it comes to gender but not species, etc., it cannot be explained entirely in terms of whether you can change or not. So I'll give the example of certain other social categories where there isn't complete self-identification, but you can change those categories. So let's take religion as an example. You can change your religion, but we don't have complete self-identification when it comes to religion. We have partial self-identification, but it's not complete. If somebody is, let's say, an atheist and they don't engage in any of the practices of Islam, they can't then call themselves a Muslim in the religious sense of the term. Similarly, with civic categories like being a citizen of a certain country, you can change that. You can immigrate and acquire citizenship of a country that you were not born with. But that doesn't mean that all you have to do is claim that you are a citizen of a certain country and you become a citizen of that country, or that you present yourself as a citizen. You just have to have a certain identity and social presentation. No, you don't have that. And the reason why you don't have that is because it is essential and necessary to the concept of citizenship, that it is a bureaucratic or civic notion that is tied to a certain bureaucratic process where somebody is given a passport or whatever it is. If that is not fulfilled, then at that point there is simply no recognizable sense in which the concept is that of citizenship. But in the case of gender, there is, because there has always been a psychological and social cultural element of gender as a significant part of what it means to be a man or a woman. That is being retained by the trans rights movement. At least it's being retained enough. Of course, we are also revising some of the social cultural elements and psychological element, but we're not removing it completely. So hopefully this clarifies why trans exists in the case of gender, but not when it comes to these other identities. Although our intuition tells us this anyway, and that's good enough for practical purposes, for most practical purposes. Hopefully this will help as well. So you can show this video to a transphobic person who raises a talking point, maybe, if they are willing to sit through this whole thing. Anyway, let me know your thoughts if you have any, and until my next video, if there is a next video, okay, bye.